He sheltered her, and soothed her, and caressed her, and kissed her, and again began to come nearer, nearer. He gathered himself together. Even if he did not take her, he would make her relax. He would fuse away her resistance. So softly, softly, with infinite caressiveness he kissed her, and the whole of his being seemed to fondle her. Till, at the verge, swooning at the breaking point, there came from her a beaten, inarticulate, moaning cry. "Don't! Oh, don't!" His veins fused with extreme voluptuousness. For a moment he almost lost control of himself, and continued automatically. But there was a moment of inaction, of cold suspension. He was not going to take her. He drew her to him and soothed her and caressed her. But the pure zest had gone. She struggled to herself and realised he was not going to take her. And then, at the very last moment, when his fondling had come near again, his hot living desire despising her against his cold sensual desire, she broke violently away from him. "Don't!" she cried, harsh now with hatred, and she flung her hand across and hit him violently. "Keep off of me!" His blood stood still for a moment. Then the smile came again within him, steady, cruel. "Why, what's the matter?" he said, with suave irony. "Nobody's going to hurt you?" "I know what you want," she said. "I know what I want," he said. "What's the odds?" "Well, you're not going to have it off me." "Aren't I? Well, then I'm not. It's no use crying about it, is it?" "No, it isn't," said the girl, rather disconcerted by his irony. "But there's no need to have a row about it. We can kiss good-night just the same, can't we?" She was silent in the darkness. "Or do you want your hat and umbrella to go home this minute?" Still she was silent. He watched her dark figure as she stood there on the edge of the faint darkness, and he waited. "Come and say good-night nicely, if we're going to say it," he said. Still she did not stir. He put his hand out and drew her into the darkness again. "It's warmer in here," he said, "a lot cosier." His will had not yet relaxed from her. The moment of hatred exhilarated him. "I'm going now," she muttered, as he closed his hand over her. "See how well you fit your place," he said, as he drew her to her previous position, close upon him. "What do you want to leave it for?" And gradually the intoxication invaded him again. The zest came back. After all, why should he not take her? But she did not yield to him entirely. "Are you a married man?" she asked, at length. "What if I am?" he said. She did not answer. "I don't ask whether you're married or not," he said. "You know jolly well I'm not," she answered hotly. Oh, if she could only break away from him. If only she need not yield to him. At length her will became cold against him. She had escaped. But she hated him for her escape more than for her danger. Did he despise her so coldly? And she was in a torture of adherence to him still. "Shall I see you next week? Next Saturday?" he said, as they returned to the town. She did not answer. "Come to the Empire with me, you and Gertie," he said. "I should look well, going with a married man," she said. "I'm no less of a man for being married, am I?" he said. "Oh, it's a different matter altogether with a married man," she said, in a ready-made speech that showed her chagrin. "How's that?" he asked. But she would not enlighten him. Yet she promised, without promising, to be at the meeting place next Saturday evening. So he left her. He did not know her name. He caught a train and went home. It was the last train. He was very late. He was not home till midnight. But he was quite indifferent. He had no real relation with his home, not this man which he now was. Anna was sitting up for him. She saw the queer, absolved look on his face, a sort of latent, almost sinister smile, as if he were absolved from his good ties. "Where have you been?" she asked, puzzled, interested. "To the Empire." "Who with?" "By myself. I came home with Tom Cooper." She looked at him and wondered what he had been doing. She was indifferent as to whether he lied or not. "You have come home very strange," she said, and there was an appreciative inflection in the speech. He was not affected. As for his humble, good self, he was absolved from it. He sat down and ate heartily. He was not tired. He seemed to take no notice of her. For Anna the moment was critical. She kept herself aloof and watched him. He talked to her, but with a little indifference, since he was scarcely aware of her. So, then she did not affect him. Here was a new turn of affairs. He was rather attractive, nevertheless. She liked him better than the ordinary mute, half-effaced, half-subdued man she usually knew him to be. So, he was blossoming out into his real self. It piqued her. Very good, let him blossom. She liked a new turn of affairs. He was a strange man come home to her. Glancing at him, she saw she could not reduce him to what he had been before. In an instant she gave it up. Yet not without a pang of rage, which would insist on their old, beloved love, their old, accustomed intimacy, and her old, established supremacy. She almost rose up to fight for them. And looking at him, and remembering his father, she was wary. This was the new turn of affairs. Very good, if she could not influence him in the old way, she would be level with him in the new. Her old defiant hostility came up. Very good, she too was out on her own adventure. Her voice, her manner changed. She was ready for the game. Something was liberated in her. She liked him. She liked this strange man come home to her. He was very welcome indeed. She was very glad to welcome a stranger. She had been bored by the old husband. To his latent, cruel smile she replied with brilliant challenge. He expected her to keep the moral fortress, not she. It was much too dull a part. She challenged him back with a sort of radiance, very bright and free, opposite to him. He looked at her, and his eyes glinted. She too was out in the field. His senses pricked up and keenly attended to her. She laughed, perfectly indifferent and loose as he was. He came towards her. She neither rejected him nor responded to him. In a kind of radiance, superb in her inscrutability, she laughed before him. She too could throw everything overboard: love, intimacy, responsibility. What were her 4 children to her now? What did it matter that this man was the father of her 4 children? He was the sensual male seeking his pleasure, she was the female ready to take hers, but in her own way. A man could turn into a freelance, so then could a woman. She adhered as little as he to the moral world. All that had gone before was nothing to her. She was another woman, under the instance of a strange man. He was a stranger to her, seeking his own ends. Very good. She wanted to see what this stranger would do now, what he was. She laughed and kept him at arm's length, whilst apparently ignoring him. She watched him undress as if he were a stranger. Indeed, he was a stranger to her. And she roused him profoundly, violently, even before he touched her. The little creature in Nottingham had been but leading up to this. They abandoned in one motion the moral position. Each was seeking gratification, pure and simple. Strange his wife was to him. It was as if he were a perfect stranger, as if she were infinitely and essentially strange to him, the other half of the world, the dark half of the moon. She waited for his touch as if he were a marauder who had come in, infinitely unknown and desirable to her, and he began to discover her. He had an inkling of the vastness of the unknown sensual store of delights she was. With a passion of voluptuousness that made him dwell on each tiny beauty, in a kind of frenzy of enjoyment, he lit upon her, her beauty, the beauties, the separate, several beauties of her body. He was quite ousted from himself, and sensually transported by that which he discovered in her. He was another man revelling over her. There was no tenderness, no love between them any more, only the maddening, sensuous lust for discovery, and the insatiable, exorbitant gratification in the sensual beauties of her body. And she was a store of absolute beauties that it drove him to contemplate. There was such a feast to enjoy, and he with only one man's capacity. He lived in a passion of sensual discovery with her for some time. It was a duel, no love, no words, no kisses even, only the maddening perception of beauty consummate, absolute through touch. He wanted to touch her, to discover her, maddeningly he wanted to know her. Yet he must not hurry, or he missed everything. He must enjoy one beauty at a time, and the multitudinous beauties of her body, the many little rapturous places, sent him mad with delight, and with desire to be able to know more, to have strength to know more, for all was there. He would say during the daytime, "Tonight I shall know the little hollow under her ankle where the blue vein crosses," and the thought of it, and the desire for it, made a thick darkness of anticipation. He would go all the day waiting for the night to come, when he could give himself to the enjoyment of some luxurious absolute of beauty in her. The thought of the hidden resources of her, the undiscovered beauties and the ecstatic places of delight in her body, waiting, only waiting for him to discover them, sent him slightly insane. He was obsessed. If he did not discover and make known to himself these delights, they might be lost forever. He wished he had 100 men's energies with which to enjoy her. He wished he were a cat, to lick her with a rough, grating, lascivious tongue. He wanted to wallow in her, bury himself in her flesh, cover himself over with her flesh. And she, separate, with a strange, dangerous, glistening look in her eyes, received all his activities upon her as if they were expected by her, and provoked him when he was quiet to more, till sometimes he was ready to perish for sheer inability to be satisfied of her, inability to have had enough of her. Her children became mere offspring to them. They lived in the darkness and death of their own sensual activities. Sometimes he felt he was going mad with a sense of absolute beauty, perceived by him in her through his senses. It was something too much for him, and in everything was this same, almost sinister, terrifying beauty. But in the revelations of her body through contact with his body was the ultimate beauty, to know which was almost death in itself, and yet for the knowledge of which he would have undergone endless torture. He would have forfeited anything, rather than forego his right even to the instep of her foot, and the place from which the toes radiated out, the little, miraculous white plain from which ran the little hillocks of the toes, and the folded, dimpling hollows between the toes. He felt he would have died rather than forfeit this. This was what their love had become, a sensuality, violent and extreme as death. They had no conscious intimacy, no tenderness of love. It was all the lust and the infinite, maddening intoxication of the sense, a passion of death. He had always, all his life, had a secret dread of absolute beauty. It had always been like a fetish to him, something to fear really, for it was immoral and against mankind. So he had turned to the Gothic form, which always asserted the broken desire of mankind in its pointed arches, escaping the rolling, absolute beauty of the round arch. But now he had given way, and with infinite sensual violence gave himself to the realization of this supreme, immoral, absolute beauty in the body of a woman. It seemed to him that it came to being in the body of a woman under his touch. Under his touch, even under his sight, it was there. But when he neither saw nor touched the perfect place, it was not perfect. It was not there, and he must make it exist. But still the thing terrified him. Awful and threatening it was, dangerous to a degree, even whilst he gave himself to it. It was pure darkness also. All the shameful things of the body revealed themselves to him now with a sort of sinister, tropical beauty. All the shameful, natural and unnatural acts of sensual voluptuousness which he and the woman partook of together, created together, they had their heavy beauty and their delight. Shame, what was it? It was part of extreme delight. It was that part of delight of which man is usually afraid. Why afraid? The secret, shameful things are most terribly beautiful. They accepted shame, and were one with it in their most unlicensed pleasures. It was incorporated. It was a bud that blossomed into beauty and heavy, fundamental gratification. Their outward life went on much the same, but the inward life was revolutionized. The children became less important. The parents were absorbed in their own living, and gradually Brangwen began to find himself free to attend to the outside life as well. His intimate life was so violently active that it set another man in him free, and this new man turned with interest to public life to see what part he could take in it. This would give him scope for new activity of a kind for which he was now created and released. He wanted to be unanimous with the whole of purposive mankind. At this time education was in the forefront as a subject of interest. There was the talk of new Swedish methods, of handwork instruction, and so on. Brangwen embraced sincerely the idea of handwork in schools. For the first time, he began to take real interest in a public affair. He had at length, from his profound sensual activity, developed a real purposive self. There was talk of night schools and of handicraft classes. He wanted to start a woodwork class in Kossete, to teach carpentry and joinery and wood carving to the village boys 2 nights a week. This seemed to him a supremely desirable thing to be doing. His pay would be very little, and when he had it, he spent it all on extra wood and tools. But he was very happy and keen in his new public spirit. He started his night classes in woodwork when he was 30 years old. By this time he had 5 children, the last a boy. But boy or girl mattered very little to him. He had a natural blood affection for his children, and he liked them as they turned up, boys or girls. Only he was fondest of Ursula. Somehow she seemed to be at the back of his new night school venture. The house by the yew trees was in connection with the great human endeavour at last. It gained a new vigour thereby. To Ursula, a child of 8, the increase in magic was considerable. She heard all the talk. She saw the parish room fitted up as a workshop. The parish room was a high, stone, barn-like, ecclesiastical building, standing away by itself in the Brangwens' second garden, across the lane. She was always attracted by its age and its stranded obsoleteness. Now she watched preparations made. She sat on the flight of stone steps that came down from the porch to the garden, and heard her father and the vicar talking and planning and working. Then an inspector came, a very strange man, and stayed talking with her father all one evening. Everything was settled, and 12 boys enrolled their names. It was very exciting. But to Ursula, everything her father did was magic. Whether he came from Ilkeston with news of the town, whether he went across to the church with his music or his tools on a sunny evening, whether he sat in his white surplice at the organ on Sundays, leading the singing with his strong tenor voice, or whether he were in the workshop with the boys, he was always a centre of magic and fascination to her. His voice, sounding out in command, cheerful, laconic, had always a twang in it that sent a thrill over her blood and hypnotised her. She seemed to run in the shadow of some dark, potent secret of which she would not, of whose existence even she dared not become conscious. It cast such a spell over her and so darkened her mind. Chapter 9. The Marsh and the Flood. There was always regular connection between the yew cottage and the marsh, yet the 2 households remained separate, distinct. After Anna's marriage, the marsh became the home of the 2 boys, Tom and Fred. Tom was a rather short, good-looking youth, with crisp black hair and long black eyelashes and soft, dark, possessed eyes. He had a quick intelligence. From the high school he went to London to study. He had an instinct for attracting people of character and energy. He gave place entirely to the other person, and at the same time kept himself independent. He scarcely existed except through other people. When he was alone he was unresolved. When he was with another man he seemed to add himself to the other, make the other bigger than life size, so that a few people loved him and attained a sort of fulfilment in him. He carefully chose these few. He had a subtle, quick, critical intelligence, a mind that was like a scale or balance. There was something of a woman in all this. In London he had been the favourite pupil of an engineer, a clever man, who became well known at the time when Tom Brangwen had just finished his studies. Through this master the youth kept acquaintance with various individual, outstanding characters. He never asserted himself. He seemed to be there to estimate and establish the rest. He was like a presence that makes us aware of our own being. So that he was, while still young, connected with some of the most energetic, scientific and mathematical people in London. They took him as an equal. Quiet and perceptive and impersonal as he was, he kept his place and learned how to value others in just degree. He was there like a judgment. Besides, he was very good looking, of medium stature but beautifully proportioned, dark with fine colouring, always perfectly healthy. His father allowed him a liberal pocket money, besides which he had a sort of post as assistant to his chief. Then from time to time the young man appeared at the Marsh, curiously attractive, well dressed, reserved, having by nature a subtle, refined manner, and he set the change in the farm. Fred, the younger brother, was a Brangwen, large-boned, blue-eyed, English. He was his father's very son. The two men, father and son, were supremely at ease with one another. Fred was succeeding to the farm. Between the elder brother and the younger existed an almost passionate love. Tom watched over Fred with a woman's poignant attention and selfless care. Fred looked up to Tom as to something miraculous, that which he himself would aspire to be, were he great also. So that after Anna's departure, the Marsh began to take on a new tone. The boys were gentlemen. Tom had a rare nature and had risen high. Fred was sensitive and fond of reading. He pondered Ruskin and then the agnostic writings. Like all the Brangwens, he was very much a thing to himself, though fond of people, and indulgent to them, having an exaggerated respect for them. There was a rather uneasy friendship between him and one of the young Hardys at the Hall. The two households were different, yet the young men met on shy terms of equality. It was young Tom Brangwen, with his dark lashes and beautiful colouring, his soft, inscrutable nature, his strange repose and his informed air, added to his position in London, who seemed to emphasise the superior foreign element in the Marsh. When he appeared, perfectly dressed, as if soft and affable, and yet quite removed from everybody, he created an uneasiness in people. He was reserved in the minds of the Cossetay and Ilkeston acquaintances to a different, remote world. He and his mother had a kind of affinity. The affection between them was of a mute, distant character, but radical. His father was always uneasy and slightly deferential to his eldest son. Tom also formed the link that kept the Marsh in real connection with the Skrebenskys, now quite important people in their own district. So a change in tone came over the Marsh. Tom Brangwen the father, as he grew older, seemed to mature into a gentleman farmer. His figure lent itself, burly and handsome. His face remained fresh, and his blue eyes as full of light. His thick hair and beard had turned gradually to a silky whiteness. It was his custom to laugh a great deal, in his acquiescent, wilful manner. Things had puzzled him very much, so he had taken the line of easy, good-humoured acceptance. He was not responsible for the frame of things, yet he was afraid of the unknown in life. He was fairly well off. His wife was there with him, a different being from himself, yet somewhere vitally connected with him. Who was he to understand where and how? His two sons were gentlemen. They were men distinct from himself. They had separate beings of their own, yet they were connected with himself. It was all adventurous and puzzling. Yet one remained vital within one's own existence, whatever the offshoots. So, handsome and puzzled, he laughed and stuck to himself, as the only thing he could stick to. His youngness and the wonder remained almost the same in him. He became indolent. He developed a luxuriant ease. Fred did most of the farm work. The father saw to the more important transactions. He drove a good mare, and sometimes he rode his cob. He drank in the hotels and the inns with better-class farmers and proprietors. He had well-to-do acquaintances among men, but one class suited him no better than another. His wife, as ever, had no acquaintances. Her hair was threaded now with grey. Her face grew older in form, without changing in expression. She seemed the same as when she had come to the Marsh 25 years ago, save that her health was more fragile. She seemed always to haunt the marsh rather than to live there. She was never part of the life. Something she represented was alien there. She remained a stranger within the gates, in some ways fixed and impervious, in some ways curiously refining. She caused the separateness and individuality of all the marsh inmates, the friability of the household. When young Tom Brangwen was 23 years old, there was some breach between him and his chief which was never explained, and he went away to Italy, then to America. He came home for a while, then went to Germany. Always the same good-looking, carefully dressed, attractive young man, in perfect health, yet somehow outside of everything. In his dark eyes was a deep misery which he wore with the same ease and pleasantness as he wore his close-sitting clothes. To Ursula he was a romantic, alluring figure. He had a grace of bringing beautiful presents, a box of expensive sweets, such as Cossethay had never seen. Or he gave her a hairbrush and a long slim mirror of mother of pearl, all pale and glimmering and exquisite. Or he sent her a little necklace of rough stones, amethyst and opal and brilliants and garnet. He spoke other languages easily and fluently. His nature was curiously gracious and insinuating. With all that, he was undefinably an outsider. He belonged to nowhere, to no society. Anna Brangwen had left her intimacy with her father undeveloped since the time of her marriage. At her marriage it had been abandoned. He and she had drawn a reserve between them. Anna went more to her mother. Then suddenly, the father died. It happened one springtime when Ursula was about 8 years old. He, Tom Brangwen, drove off on a Saturday morning to the market in Nottingham, saying he might not be back till late, as there was a special show and then a meeting he had to attend. His family understood that he would enjoy himself. The season had been rainy and dreary. In the evening it was pouring with rain. Fred Brangwen, unsettled, uneasy, did not go out, as was his wont. He smoked and read and fidgeted, hearing always the trickling of water outside. This wet, black night seemed to cut him off and make him unsettled, aware of himself, aware that he wanted something else, aware that he was scarcely living. There seemed to him to be no root to his life, no place for him to get satisfied in. He dreamed of going abroad, but his instinct knew that change of place would not solve his problem. He wanted change, deep, vital change of living, and he did not know how to get it. Tilly, an old woman now, came in saying that the labourers who had been suppering up said the yard and everywhere was just a slough of water. He heard in indifference, but he hated a desolate, raw wetness in the world. He would leave the marsh. His mother was in bed. At last he shut his book. His mind was blank. He walked upstairs intoxicated with depression and anger, and, intoxicated with depression and anger, locked himself into sleep. Tilly set slippers before the kitchen fire, and she also went to bed, leaving the door unlocked. Then the farm was in darkness, in the rain. At 11 o'clock it was still raining. Tom Brangwen stood in the yard of the Angel, Nottingham, and buttoned his coat. "Oh well," he said cheerfully, "it's rained on me before. Put her in, Jack, my lad, put her in. Thou'rt a rare old cock, Jacky boy, wi' a belly on thee as does credit to thy drink, if not to thy corn. Cope, lass, let's get off to th' old homestead. Oh, my heart, what a wetness in the night. There'll be no volcanoes after this. Hey, Jack, my beautiful young slender fella, which of us is Noah? It seemed as though the waterworks is bursted. Ducks and aquatic fowl will be king of the castle at this rate, dove and olive branch and all. Stand up then, girl, stand up. We're not stopping here all night, even if you thought we was. I'm dashed if the jumping rain wouldn't make anybody think they was drunk. Hey, Jack, does rainwater wash the sense in, or does it wash it out?" And he laughed to himself at the joke. He was always ashamed when he had to drive after he had been drinking, always apologetic to the horse. His apologetic frame made him facetious. He was aware of his inability to walk quite straight. Nevertheless, his will kept stiff and attentive in all his fuddleness. He mounted and bowled off through the gates of the inn-yard. The mare went well. He sat fixed, the rain beating on his face. His heavy body rode motionless in a kind of sleep. One centre of attention was kept fitfully burning, the rest was dark. He concentrated his last attention on the fact of driving along the road he knew so well. He knew it so well he watched for it attentively, with an effort of will. He talked aloud to himself, sententious in his anxiety, as if he were perfectly sober, whilst the mare bowled along and the rain beat on him. He watched the rain before the gig lamps, the faint gleaming of the shadowy horse's body, the passing of the dark hedges. "It's not a fit night to turn a dog out," he said to himself aloud. "It's high time as it did a bit of clearing up. I'll be damned if it isn't. It was a lot of use putting those 10 loads of cinder on th' road. They'll be washed to kingdom come if it doesn't alter. Well, it's our Fred's lookout, if they are. He's top sawyer as far as those things go. I don't see why I should concern myself. They can wash to kingdom come and back again for what I care. I suppose they would be washed back again some day. That's how things are. The rain tumbles down just to mount up in clouds again. So they say. There's no more water on the earth than there was in the year naught. That's the story, my boy, if you understand it. There's no more today than there was 1,000 years ago, nor less either. You can't wear water out. No, my boy, it'll give you the go-by. Try to wear it out, and it takes its hook into vapour. It has its fingers at its nose to you. It turns into cloud and falleth as rain on the just and unjust. I wonder if I'm the just or the unjust." He started awake as the trap lurched deep into a rut, and he wakened to the point in his journey. He had travelled some distance since he was last conscious. But at length he reached the gate and stumbled heavily down, reeling, gripping fast to the trap. He descended into several inches of water. "Be damned," he said angrily. "Be damned to the miserable slop." And he led the horse washing through the gate. He was quite drunk now, moving blindly, in habit. Everywhere there was water underfoot. The raised causeway of the house and the farmstead was dry, however, but there was a curious roar in the night which seemed to be made in the darkness of his own intoxication. Reeling, blinded, almost without consciousness, he carried his parcels and the rug and cushions into the house, dropped them, and went out to put up the horse. Now he was at home, he was a sleepwalker, waiting only for the moment of activity to stop. Very deliberately and carefully he led the horse down the slope to the cart shed. She shied and backed. "Why, what's amiss?" he hiccuped, plodding steadily on, and he was again in a wash of water. The horse splashed up water as he went. It was thickly dark, save for the gig lamps, and they lit on a rippling surface of water. "Well, that's a knock-out," he said, as he came to the cart shed, and was wading in 6 inches of water. But everything seemed to him amusing. He laughed to think of 6 inches of water being in the cart shed. He backed in the mare. She was rested. He laughed at the fun of untackling the mare with a lot of water washing round his feet. He laughed because it upset her. "What's amiss? What's amiss? A drop of water won't hurt you." As soon as he had undone the traces, she walked quickly away. He hung up the shafts and took the gig lamp. As he came out of the familiar jumble of shafts and wheels in the shed, the water, in little waves, came washing strongly against his legs. He staggered and almost fell. "Well, what the deuce?" he said, staring round at the running water in the black, watery night. He went to meet the running flood, sinking deeper and deeper. His soul was full of great astonishment. He had to go and look where it came from, though the ground was going from under his feet. He went on, down towards the pond, shakily. He rather enjoyed it. He was knee-deep, and the water was pulling heavily. He stumbled, reeled sickeningly. Fear took hold of him. Gripping tightly to the lamp, he reeled and looked round. The water was carrying his feet away. He was dizzy. He did not know which way to turn. The water was whirling, whirling. The whole black night was swooping in rings. He swayed uncertainly at the centre of all the attack, reeling in dismay. In his soul he knew he would fall. As he staggered, something in the water struck his legs, and he fell. Instantly he was in the turmoil of suffocation. He fought in a black horror of suffocation, fighting, wrestling, but always borne borne inevitably down. Still he wrestled and fought to get himself free, in the unutterable struggle of suffocation, but he always fell again deeper. Something struck his head, a great wonder of anguish went over him, and the blackness covered him entirely. In the utter darkness, the unconscious, drowning body was rolled along, the waters pouring, washing, filling in the place. The cattle woke up and rose to their feet, the dog began to yelp, and the unconscious, drowning body was washed along in the black, swirling darkness, passively. Mrs. Brangwen woke up and listened. With preternaturally sharp senses she heard the movement of all the darkness that swirled outside. For a moment she lay still. Then she went to the window. She heard the sharp rain and the deep running of water. She knew her husband was outside. "Fred!" she called. "Fred!" Away in the night was a hoarse, brutal roar of a mass of water rushing downwards. She went downstairs. She could not understand the multiplied running of water. Stepping down the step into the kitchen, she put her foot into water. The kitchen was flooded. Where did it come from? She could not understand. Water was running in out of the scullery. She paddled through barefoot to see. Water was bubbling fiercely under the outer door. She was afraid. Then something washed against her. Something twined under her foot. It was the riding whip. On the table were the rug and the cushion and the parcel from the gig. He had come home. "Tom!" she called, afraid of her own voice. She opened the door. Water ran in with a horrid sound. Everywhere was moving water, a sound of waters. "Tom!" she cried, standing in her nightdress with the candle, calling into the darkness and the flood out of the doorway. "Tom! Tom!" And she listened. Fred appeared behind her, in trousers and shirt. "Where is he?" he asked. He looked at the flood, then at his mother. She seemed small and uncanny, elvish, in her nightdress. "Go upstairs," he said. "He'll be in the stable." "Tom! Tom!" cried the elderly woman, with a long, unnatural, penetrating call that chilled her son to the marrow. He quickly pulled on his boots and his coat. "Go upstairs, mother," he said. "I'll go and see where he is." "Tom! Tom!" rang out the shrill, unearthly cry of the small woman. There was only the noise of water and the mooing of uneasy cattle and the long yelping of the dog, clamouring in the darkness. Fred Brangwen splashed out into the flood with a lantern. His mother stood on a chair in the doorway, watching him go. It was all water, water, running, flashing under the lantern. "Tom! Tom! Tom!" came her long, unnatural cry, ringing over the night. It made her son feel cold in his soul. And the unconscious, drowning body of the father rolled on below the house, driven by the black water towards the high road. Tilly appeared, a skirt over her nightdress. She saw her mistress clinging on the top of a chair in the open doorway, a candle burning on the table. "God's sake!" cried the old serving woman. "The cut's burst! That embankment's broke down! Whatever are we going to do?" Mrs. Brangwen watched her son and the lantern go along the upper causeway to the stable. Then she saw the dark figure of a horse. Then her son hung the lamp in the stable, and the light shone out faintly on him as he untackled the mare. The mother saw the soft, blazed face of the horse thrust forward into the stable door. The stables were still above the flood, but the water flowed strongly into the house. "It's getting higher," said Tilly. "Hasn't master come in?" Mrs. Brangwen did not hear. "Isn't he there?" she called, in her far-reaching, terrifying voice. "No," came the short answer out of the night. "Go and look for him." His mother's voice nearly drove the youth mad. He put the halter on the horse and shut the stable door. He came splashing back through the water, the lantern swinging. The unconscious, drowning body was pushed past the house in the deepest current. Fred Brangwen came to his mother. "I'll go to the cart shed," he said. "Tom! Tom!" rang out the strong, inhuman cry. Fred Brangwen's blood froze. His heart was very angry. He gripped his veins in a frenzy. Why was she yelling like this? He could not bear the sight of her, perched on a chair in her white nightdress in the doorway, elvish and horrible. "He's taken the mare out of the trap, so he's all right," he said, growling, pretending to be normal. But as he descended to the cart shed, he sank into a foot of water. He heard the rushing in the distance. He knew the canal had broken down. The water was running deeper. The trap was there all right, but no signs of his father. The young man waded down to the pond. The water rose above his knees. It swirled and forced him. He drew back. "Is he there?" came the maddening cry of the mother. "No," was the sharp answer. "Tom! Tom!" came the piercing, free, unearthly call. It seemed high and supernatural, almost pure. Fred Brangwen hated it. It nearly drove him mad. So awfully it sang out, almost like a song. The water was flowing fuller into the house. "You'd better go up to Beebe's and bring him and Arthur down, and tell Mrs. Beebe to fetch Wilkinson," said Fred to Tilly. He forced his mother to go upstairs. "I know your father is drowned," she said, in a curious dismay. The flood rose through the night, till it washed the kettle off the hob in the kitchen. Mrs. Brangwen sat alone at a window upstairs. She called no more. The men were busy with the pigs and the cattle. They were coming with a boat for her. Towards morning the rain ceased. The stars came out over the noise and the terrifying clucking and trickling of the water. Then there was a pallor in the east. The light began to come. In the ruddy light of the dawn she saw the waters spreading out, moving sluggishly, the buildings rising out of a waste of water. Birds began to sing, drowsily, and as if slightly hoarse with the dawn. It grew brighter. Up the second field was the great, raw gap in the canal embankment. Mrs. Brangwen went from window to window, watching the flood. Somebody had brought a little boat. The light grew stronger. The red gleam was gone off the floodwaters. Day took place. Mrs. Brangwen went from the front of the house to the back, looking out, intent and unrelaxing, on the pallid morning of spring. She saw a glimpse of her husband's buff coat in the floods, as the water rolled the body against the garden hedge. She called to the men in the boat. She was glad he was found. They dragged him out of the hedge. They could not lift him into the boat. Fred Brangwen jumped into the water, up to his waist, and half carried the body of his father through the flood to the road. Hay and twigs and dirt were in the beard and hair. The youth pushed through the water, crying loudly without tears, like a stricken animal. The mother at the window cried, making no trouble. The doctor came, but the body was dead. They carried it up to Cossethay, to Anna's house. When Anna Brangwen heard the news, she pressed back her head and rolled her eyes, as if something were reaching forward to bite at her throat. She pressed back her head. Her mind was driven back to sleep. Since she had married and become a mother, the girl she had been was forgotten. Now the shock threatened to break in upon her and sweep away all her intervening life, make her as a girl of 18 again, loving her father. So she pressed back, away from the shock. She clung to her present life. It was when they brought him to her house, dead and in his wet clothes, his wet, sodden clothes, fully dressed as he came from market, yet all sodden and inert, that the shock really broke into her, and she was terrified. A big, soaked, inert heap he was, who had been to her the image of power and strong life. Almost in horror she began to take the wet things from him, to pull off him the incongruous market clothes of a well-to-do farmer. The children were sent away to the vicarage. The dead body lay on the parlour floor. Anna quickly began to undress him, laid his fob and seals in a wet heap on the table. Her husband and the woman helped her. They cleared and washed the body, and laid it on the bed. There it looked still and grand. He was perfectly calm in death, and now he was laid in line, inviolable, unapproachable. To Anna he was the majesty of the inaccessible male, the majesty of death. It made her still and awe-stricken, almost glad. Lydia Brangwen, the mother, also came and saw the impressive, inviolable body of the dead man. She went pale, seeing death. He was beyond change or knowledge, absolute, laid in line with the infinite. What had she to do with him? He was a majestic abstraction, made visible now for a moment, inviolate, absolute. And who could lay claim to him? Who could speak of him? Of the him who was revealed in the stripped moment of transit from life into death? Neither the living nor the dead could claim him. He was both the one and the other, inviolable, inaccessibly himself. "I shared life with you. I belong in my own way to eternity," said Lydia Brangwen, her heart cold, knowing her own singleness. "I did not know you in life. You are beyond me, supreme now in death," said Anna Brangwen, awe-stricken, almost glad. It was the sons who could not bear it. Fred Brangwen went about with a set, blanched face and shut hands, his heart full of hatred and rage for what had been done to his father, bleeding also with desire to have his father again, to see him, to hear him again. He could not bear it. Tom Brangwen only arrived on the day of the funeral. He was quiet and controlled as ever. He kissed his mother, who was still dark-faced, inscrutable. He shook hands with his brother without looking at him. He saw the great coffin with its black handles. He even read the nameplate, "Tom Brangwen of the Marsh Farm, born, died." The good-looking, still face of the young man crinkled up for a moment in a terrible grimace, then resumed its stillness. The coffin was carried round to the church. The funeral bell tanged at intervals. The mourners carried their wreaths of white flowers. The mother, the Polish woman, went with dark, abstract face on her son's arm. He was good-looking as ever, his face perfectly motionless and somehow pleasant. Fred walked with Anna, she strange and winsome, he with a face like wood, stiff, unyielding. Only afterwards Ursula, flitting between the currant bushes down the garden, saw her Uncle Tom, standing in his black clothes, erect and fashionable, but his fists lifted, and his face distorted, his lips curled back from his teeth in a horrible grin, like an animal which grimaces with torment, whilst his body panted quick like a panting dog's. He was facing the open distance, panting and holding still, then panting rapidly again, but his face never changing from its almost bestial look of torture, the teeth all showing, the nose wrinkled up, the eyes, unseeing, fixed. Terrified, Ursula slipped away, and when her Uncle Tom was in the house again, grave and very quiet, so that he seemed almost to affect gravity, to pretend grief, she watched his still, handsome face, imagining it again in its distortion. But she saw the nose was rather thick, rather Russian, under its transparent skin. She remembered the teeth under the carefully cut moustache were small and sharp and spaced. She could see him, in all his elegant demeanour, bestial, almost corrupt, and she was frightened. She never forgot to look for the bestial, frightening side of him after this. He said good-bye to his mother and went away at once. Ursula almost shrank from his kiss now. She wanted it, nevertheless, and the little revulsion as well. At the funeral, and after the funeral, Will Brangwen was madly in love with his wife. The death had shaken him, but death and all seemed to gather in him into a mad, overwhelming passion for his wife. She seemed so strange and winsome. He was almost beside himself with desire for her. And she took him. She seemed ready for him. She wanted him. The grandmother stayed a while at the Yew Cottage, till the marsh was restored. Then she returned to her own rooms, quiet, and it seemed wanting nothing. Fred threw himself into the work of restoring the farm. That his father was killed there seemed to make it only the more intimate and the more inevitably his own place. There was a saying that the Brangwens always died a violent death. To them all, except perhaps Tom, it seemed almost natural. Yet Fred went about obstinate, his heart fixed. He could never forgive the unknown this murder of his father. After the death of the father the marsh was very quiet. Mrs. Brangwen was unsettled. She could not sit all the evening peacefully, as she could before, and during the day she was always rising to her feet and hesitating, as if she must go somewhere, and were not quite sure whither. She was seen loitering about the garden in her little woolen jacket. She was often driven out in the gig, sitting beside her son and watching the countryside or the streets of the town with a childish, candid, uncanny face, as if it all were strange to her. The children, Ursula and Gudrun and Teresa, went by the garden gate on their way to school. The grandmother would have them call in each time they passed. She would have them come to the marsh for dinner. She wanted children about her. Of her sons she was almost afraid. She could see the sombre passion and desire and dissatisfaction in them, and she wanted not to see it any more. Even Fred, with his blue eyes and his heavy jaw, troubled her. There was no peace. He wanted something. He wanted love, passion, and he could not find them. But why must he trouble her? Why must he come to her with his seething and suffering and dissatisfactions? She was too old. Tom was more restrained, reserved. He kept his body very still, but he troubled her even more. She could not but see the black depths of disintegration in his eyes, the sudden glance upon her, as if she could save him, as if he would reveal himself. And how could age save youth? Youth must go to youth. Always the storm. Could she not lie in peace these years, in the quiet, apart from life? No. Always the swell must heave upon her and break against the barriers. Always she must be embroiled in the seethe and rage and passion, endless, endless, going on forever. And she wanted to draw away. She wanted at last her own innocence and peace. She did not want her sons to force upon her any more the old brutal story of desire and offerings and deep, deep hidden rage of unsatisfied men against women. She wanted to be beyond it all, to know the peace and innocence of age. She had never been a woman to work much, so that now she would stand often at the garden gate, watching the scant world go by, and the sight of children pleased her, made her happy. She had usually an apple or a few sweets in her pocket. She liked children to smile at her. She never went to her husband's grave. She spoke of him simply, as if he were alive. Sometimes the tears would run down her face in helpless sadness. Then she recovered and was herself again, happy. On wet days she stayed in bed. Her bedroom was her city of refuge, where she could lie down and muse and muse. Sometimes Fred would read to her, but that did not mean much. She had so many dreams to dream over, such an unsifted store. She wanted time. Her chief friend at this period was Ursula. The little girl and the musing, fragile woman of 60 seemed to understand the same language. At Cossethay all was activity and passion. Everything moved upon poles of passion. Then there were 4 children younger than Ursula, a throng of babies, all the time many lives beating against each other. So that for the eldest child, the peace of the grandmother's bedroom was exquisite. Here Ursula came as to a hushed, paradisal land. Here her own existence became simple and exquisite to her, as if she were a flower. Always on Saturdays she came down to the marsh, and always clutching a little offering, either a little mat made of strips of coloured, woven paper, or a tiny basket made in the kindergarten lesson, or a little crayon drawing of a bird. When she appeared in the doorway, Tilly, ancient but still in authority, would crane her skinny neck to see who it was. "Oh, it's you, is it?" she said. "I thought we should be seeing you. My word, that's a bobby-dazzling posy you've brought." It was curious how Tilly preserved the spirit of Tom Brangwen, who was dead in the marsh. Ursula always connected her with her grandfather. This day the child had brought a tight little nosegay of pinks, white ones, with a rim of pink ones. She was very proud of it, and very shy because of her pride. "Your grandmother's in her bed. Wipe your shoes well if you're going up, and don't go bursting in on her like a skyrocket. My word, but that's a fine posy. Did you do it all by yourself and all?" Tilly stealthily ushered her into the bedroom. The child entered with a strange, dragging hesitation, characteristic of her when she was moved. Her grandmother was sitting up in bed, wearing a little grey woolen jacket. The child hesitated in silence near the bed, clutching the nosegay in front of her. Her childish eyes were shining. The grandmother's grey eyes shone with a similar light. "How pretty," she said. "How pretty you have made them. What a darling little bunch." Ursula, glowing, thrust them into her grandmother's hands, saying, "I made them you." "That is how the peasants tied them at home," said the grandmother, pushing the pinks with her fingers and smelling them. "Just such tight little bunches. And they make wreaths for their hair. They weave the stalks. Then they go round with wreaths in their hair and wearing their best aprons." Ursula immediately imagined herself in this storyland. "Did you used to have a wreath in your hair, grandmother?" "When I was a little girl, I had golden hair, something like Katie's. Then I used to have a wreath of little blue flowers, oh, so blue, that come when the snow is gone. Andre, the coachman, used to bring me the very first." They talked, and then Tilly brought the tea tray, set for two. Ursula had a special green and gold cup kept for herself at the Marsh. There was thin bread and butter, and cress for tea. It was all special and wonderful. She ate very daintily, with little fastidious bites. "Why do you have two wedding rings, grandmother? Must you?" asked the child, noticing her grandmother's ivory-coloured hand, with blue veins above the tray. "If I had two husbands, child." Ursula pondered a moment. "Then you must wear both rings together." "Yes." "Which was my grandfather's ring?" The woman hesitated. "This grandfather whom you knew, this was his ring, the red one. The yellow one was your other grandfather's, whom you never knew." Ursula looked interestedly at the two rings on the proffered finger. "Where did he buy it you?" she asked. "This one? In Warsaw, I think." "You didn't know my own grandfather then?" "Not this grandfather." Ursula pondered this fascinating intelligence. "Did he have white whiskers as well?" "No, his beard was dark. You have his brows, I think." Ursula ceased and became self-conscious. She at once identified herself with her Polish grandfather. "And did he have brown eyes?" "Yes, dark eyes. He was a clever man, as quick as a lion. He was never still." Lydia still resented Lenski. When she thought of him, she was always younger than he. She was always 20 or 25, and under his domination. He incorporated her in his ideas as if she were not a person herself, as if she were just his aide-de-camp, or part of his baggage, or one among his surgical appliances. She still resented it. And he was always only 30. He had died when he was 34. She did not feel sorry for him. He was older than she. Yet she still ached in the thought of those days. "Did you like my first grandfather best?" asked Ursula. "I liked them both," said the grandmother. And, thinking, she became again Lenski's girl bride. He was of good family, of better family even than her own, for she was half German. She was a young girl in a house of insecure fortune, and he, an intellectual, a clever surgeon and physician, had loved her. How she had looked up to him! She remembered her first transports when he talked to her, the important young man with the severe black beard. He had seemed so wonderful, such an authority. After her own lax household, his gravity and confident, hard authority seemed almost godlike to her. For she had never known it in her life. All her surroundings had been loose, lax, disordered, a welter. "Miss Lydia, will you marry me?" he had said to her, in German, in his grave yet tremulous voice. She had been afraid of his dark eyes upon her. They did not see her, they were fixed upon her. And he was hard, confident. She thrilled with the excitement of it, and accepted. During the courtship his kisses were a wonder to her. She always thought about them, and wondered over them. She never wanted to kiss him back. In her idea the man kissed, and the woman examined in her soul the kisses she had received. She had never quite recovered from her prostration of the first days or nights of marriage. He had taken her to Vienna, and she was utterly alone with him, utterly alone in another world, everything foreign, even he foreign to her. Then came the real marriage. Passion came to her, and she became his slave. He was her lord, her lord. She was the girl bride, the slave. She kissed his feet. She had thought it an honour to touch his body, to unfasten his boots. For 2 years she had gone on as his slave, crouching at his feet, embracing his knees. Children had come. He had followed his ideas. She was there for him, just to keep him in condition. She was to him one of the baser or material conditions necessary for his welfare in prosecuting his ideas of nationalism, of liberty, of science. But gradually at 23, 24, she began to realise that she too might consider these ideas. By his acceptance of her self-subordination, he exhausted the feeling in her. There were those of his associates who would discuss the ideas with her, though he did not wish to do so himself. She had ventured into the minds of other men. His, then, was not the only male mind. She did not exist, then, just as his attribute. She began to perceive the attention of other men. An excitement came over her. She remembered now the men who had paid her court, when she was married, in Warsaw. Then the rebellion broke out, and she was inspired too. She would go as a nurse at her husband's side. He worked like a lion, he wore his life out, and she followed him helplessly. But she disbelieved in him. He was so separate, he ignored so much. He counted too much on himself, his work, his ideas. Did nothing else matter? Then the children were dead, and for her everything became remote. He became remote. She saw him go white when he heard the news, then frown as if he thought, "Why have they died now, when I have no time to grieve?" "He has no time to grieve," she had said, in her remote, awful soul. "He has no time. It is so important what he does. He is then so self-important, this half-frenzied man. Nothing matters but this work of rebellion. He has not time to grieve, nor to think of his children. He had not time even to beget them, really." She had let him go on alone, but in the chaos she had worked by his side again, and out of the chaos she had fled with him to London. He was a broken, cold man. He had no affection for her, nor for anyone. He had failed in his work, so everything had failed. He stiffened and died. She could not subscribe. He had failed, everything had failed, yet behind the failure was the unyielding passion of life. The individual effort might fail, but not the human joy. She belonged to the human joy. He died and went his way, but not before there was another child. And this little Ursula was his grandchild. She was glad of it, but she still honoured him, though he had been mistaken. She, Lydia Brangwen, was sorry for him now. He was dead. He had scarcely lived. He had never known her. He had lain with her, but he had never known her. He had never received what she could give him. He had gone away from her empty. So he had never lived. So he had died and passed away. Yet there had been strength and power in him. She could scarcely forgive him that he had never lived. If it were not for Anna and for this little Ursula who had his brows, there would be no more left of him than of a broken vessel, thrown away and just remembered. Tom Brangwen had served her. He had come to her and taken from her. He had died and gone his way into death, but he had made himself immortal in his knowledge with her. So she had her place here, in life, and in immortality. For he had taken his knowledge of her into death, so that she had her place in death. In my father's house are many mansions. She loved both her husbands. To one she had been a naked little girl bride running to serve him. The other she loved out of fulfilment, because he was good and had given her being, because he had served her honourably, and become her man, one with her. She was established in this stretch of life. She had come to herself. During her first marriage she had not existed, except through him. He was the substance, and she the shadow running at his feet. She was very glad she had come to her own self. She was grateful to Brangwen. She reached out to him in gratitude, into death. In her heart she felt a vague tenderness and pity for her first husband, who had been her lord. He was so wrong when he died. She could not bear it, that he had never lived, never really become himself. And he had been her lord. Strange it had all been. Why had he been her lord? He seemed now so far off, so without bearing on her. "Which did you, grandmother?" "What?" "Like best?" "I liked them both. I married the first when I was quite a girl. Then I loved your grandfather when I was a woman. There is a difference." They were silent for a time. "Did you cry when my first grandfather died?" the child asked. Lydia Brangwen rocked herself on the bed, thinking aloud. "When we came to England, he hardly ever spoke. He was too much concerned to take any notice of anybody. He grew thinner and thinner till his cheeks were hollow and his mouth stuck out. He wasn't handsome any more. I knew he couldn't bear being beaten. I thought everything was lost in the world. Only I had your mother, a baby. It was no use my dying." He looked at me with his black eyes, almost as if he hated me, when he was ill, and said, "It only wanted this. It only wanted that I should leave you and a young child to starve in this London." I told him we should not starve, but I was young and foolish and frightened, which he knew. He was bitter, and he never gave way. He lay beating his brains to see what he could do. "I don't know what you will do," he said. "I am no good. I am a failure from beginning to end. I cannot even provide for my wife and child." But, you see, it was not for him to provide for us. My life went on, though he stopped, and I married your grandfather. I ought to have known. I ought to have been able to say to him, 'Don't be so bitter. Don't die because this has failed. You're not the beginning and the end.' But I was too young. He had never let me become myself. I thought he was truly the beginning and the end, so I let him take all upon himself. Yet all did not depend on him. Life must go on, and I must marry your grandfather, and have your Uncle Tom and your Uncle Fred. We cannot take so much upon ourselves." The child's heart beat fast as she listened to these things. She could not understand, but she seemed to feel far-off things. It gave her a deep, joyous thrill to know she hailed from far off, from Poland, and that dark-bearded, impressive man. Strange her antecedents were, and she felt fate on either side of her terrible. Almost every day Ursula saw her grandmother, and every time they talked together, till the grandmother's sayings and stories, told in the complete hush of the Marsh bedroom, accumulated with mystic significance and became a sort of Bible to the child. And Ursula asked her deepest, childish questions of her grandmother. "Will somebody love me, grandmother?" "Many people love you, child. We all love you. But when I am grown up, will somebody love me?" "Yes, some man will love you, child, because it's your nature. And I hope it will be somebody who will love you for what you are, and not for what he wants of you. But we have a right to what we want." Ursula was frightened, hearing these things. Her heart sank. She felt she had no ground under her feet. She clung to her grandmother. Here was peace and security. Here, from her grandmother's peaceful room, the door opened onto the greater space, the past, which was so big that all it contained seemed tiny. Loves and births and deaths, tiny units and features within a vast horizon. That was a great relief, to know the tiny importance of the individual within the great past. Chapter 10. The Widening Circle. It was very burdensome to Ursula that she was the eldest of the family. By the time she was 11, she had to take to school Gudrun and Teresa and Catherine. The boy, William, always called Billy, so that he should not be confused with his father, was a lovable, rather delicate child of 3, so he stayed at home as yet. There was another baby girl, called Cassandra. The children went for a time to the little church school just near the marsh. It was the only place within reach, and being so small, Mrs. Brangwen felt safe in sending her children there, though the village boys did nickname Ursula Ertler, and Gudrun Gudrunner, and Teresa Teapot. Gudrun and Ursula were co-mates. The second child, with her long, sleepy body and her endless chain of fancies, would have nothing to do with realities. She was not for them, she was for her own fancies. Ursula was the one for realities. So Gudrun left all such to her elder sister, and trusted in her implicitly, indifferently. Ursula had a great tenderness for her co-mate sister. It was no good trying to make Gudrun responsible. She floated along like a fish in the sea, perfectly within the medium of her own difference and being. Other existence did not trouble her. Only she believed in Ursula and trusted to Ursula. The eldest child was very much fretted by her responsibility for the other young ones, especially Teresa, a sturdy, bold-eyed thing, had a faculty for warfare. "Our Ursula, Billy Pillins has looked my hair." "What did you say to him?" "I said nothing." Then the Brangwen girls were in for a feud with the Pillinses, or Phillipses. "You won't pull my hair again, Billy Pillins," said Teresa, walking with her sisters, and looking superbly at the freckled, red-haired boy. "Why shan't I?" retorted Billy Pillins. "You won't because you dursn't," said the tiresome Teresa. "You come here then, Teapot, and see if I dursna." Up marched Teapot, and immediately Billy Pillins lugged her black, snaky locks. In a rage she flew at him. Immediately in rushed Ursula and Gudrun, and little Katie. In clashed the other Phillipses, Clem and Walter, and Eddie Anthony. Then there was a fray. The Brangwen girls were well grown and stronger than many boys. But for pinafores and long hair, they would have carried easy victories. They went home, however, with hair lugged and pinafores torn. It was a joy to the Phillips boys to rip the pinafores of the Brangwen girls. Then there was an outcry. Mrs. Brangwen would not have it. No, she would not. All her innate dignity and standoffishness rose up. Then there was the vicar lecturing the school. It was a sad thing that the boys of Cossethay could not behave more like gentlemen to the girls of Cossethay. Indeed, what kind of boy was it that should set upon a girl, and kick her, and beat her, and tear her pinafore? That boy deserved severe castigation, and the name of coward, for no boy who was not a coward, etc., etc. Meanwhile, much hangdog fury in the Pillinses' hearts, much virtue in the Brangwen girls, particularly in Teresa's. And the feud continued, with periods of extraordinary amity, when Ursula was Clem Phillips' sweetheart, and Gudrun was Walter's, and Teresa was Billy's, and even the tiny Katie had to be Eddie Anthony's sweetheart. There was the closest union. At every possible moment the little gang of Brangwens and Phillipses flew together. Yet neither Ursula nor Gudrun would have any real intimacy with the Phillips boys. It was a sort of fiction to them, this alliance and this dubbing of sweethearts. Again Mrs. Brangwen rose up. "Ursula, I will not have you raking the roads with lads, so I tell you. Now stop it, and the rest will stop it." How Ursula hated always to represent the little Brangwen club. She could never be herself, no, she was always Ursula, Gudrun, Teresa, Catherine, and later even Billy was added on to her. Moreover, she did not want the Phillipses either. She was out of taste with them. However, the Brangwen-Pillins coalition readily broke down, owing to the unfair superiority of the Brangwens. The Brangwens were rich. They had free access to the Marsh Farm. The school teachers were almost respectful to the girls. The vicar spoke to them on equal terms. The Brangwen girls presumed. They tossed their heads. "You're not everybody Urtler Brangwen ugly mug," said Clem Phillips, his face going very red. "I'm better than you, for all that," retorted Urtler. "You think you are, with a face like that, ugly mug. Urtler Brangwen," he began to jeer, trying to set all the others in cry against her. Then there was hostility again. How she hated their jeering. She became cold against the Phillipses. Ursula was very proud in her family. The Brangwen girls had all a curious, blind dignity, even a kind of nobility in their bearing. By some result of breed and upbringing, they seemed to rush along their own lives without caring that they existed to other people. Never from the start did it occur to Ursula that other people might hold a low opinion of her. She thought that whosoever knew her knew she was enough and accepted her as such. She thought it was a world of people like herself. She suffered bitterly if she were forced to have a low opinion of any person, and she never forgave that person. This was maddening to many little people. All their lives the Brangwens were meeting folk who tried to pull them down to make them seem little. Curiously, the mother was aware of what would happen, and was always ready to give her children the advantage of the move. When Ursula was 12, and the common school and the companionship of the village children, niggardly and begrudging, was beginning to affect her, Anna sent her with Gudrun to the grammar school in Nottingham. This was a great release for Ursula. She had a passionate craving to escape from the belittling circumstances of life, the little jealousies, the little differences, the little meannesses. It was a torture to her that the Phillipses were poorer and meaner than herself, that they used mean little reservations, took petty little advantages. She wanted to be with her equals, but not by diminishing herself. She did want Clem Phillips to be her equal, but by some puzzling, painful fate or other, when he was really there with her, he produced in her a tight feeling in the head. She wanted to beat her for it, to escape. Then she found that the way to escape was easy. One departed from the whole circumstance. One went away to the grammar school, and left the little school, the meagre teachers, the Phillipses whom she had tried to love but who had made her fail, and whom she could not forgive. She had an instinctive fear of petty people, as a deer is afraid of dogs. Because she was blind, she could not calculate nor estimate people. She must think that everybody was just like herself. She measured by the standard of her own people, her father and mother, her grandmother, her uncles, her beloved father, so utterly simple in his demeanour, yet with his strong, dark soul fixed like a root in unexpressed depths that fascinated and terrified her. Her mother, so strangely free of all money and convention and fear, entirely indifferent to the world, standing by herself, without connection. Her grandmother, who had come from so far and was centred in so wide an horizon. People must come up to these standards before they could be Ursula's people. So even as a girl of 12 she was glad to burst the narrow boundary of Cossethay, where only limited people lived. Outside was all vastness, and a throng of real proud people whom she would love. Going to school by train, she must leave home at 7:45 in the morning, and she did not arrive again till 5:30 at evening. Of this she was glad, for the house was small and over full. It was a storm of movement, whence there had been no escape. She hated so much being in charge. The house was a storm of movement. The children were healthy and turbulent. The mother only wanted their animal well-being. To Ursula, as she grew a little older, it became a nightmare. When she saw later a Rubens picture with storms of naked babies, and found this was called fecundity, she shuddered, and the world became abhorrent to her. She knew as a child what it was to live amidst storms of babies, in the heat and swelter of fecundity. And as a child she was against her mother, passionately against her mother. She craved for some spirituality and stateliness. In bad weather home was a bedlam. Children dashed in and out of the rain, to the puddles under the dismal yew trees, across the wet flagstones of the kitchen, whilst the cleaning woman grumbled and scolded. Children were swarming on the sofa. Children were kicking the piano in the parlour to make it sound like a beehive. Children were rolling on the hearthrug, legs in air, pulling a book in two between them. Children, fiendish, ubiquitous, were stealing upstairs to find out where our Ursula was, whispering at bedroom doors, hanging on the latch, calling mysteriously, "Ursula! Ursula!" to the girl who had locked herself in to read. And it was hopeless. The locked door excited their sense of mystery. She had to open to dispel the lure. These children hung on to her with round-eyed, excited questions. The mother flourished amid all this. "Better have them noisy than ill," she said. But the growing girls, in turn, suffered bitterly. Ursula was just coming to the stage when Andersen and Grimm were being left behind for the idylls of the king and romantic love stories. Elaine, the fair Elaine the lovable, Elaine the lily maid of Astolat, high in her chamber in a tower to the east, guarded the sacred shield of Launcelot. How she loved it! How she leaned in her bedroom window, with her black, rough hair on her shoulders, and her warm face all wrapped, and gazed across at the churchyard and the little church, which was a turreted castle, whence Launcelot would ride just now, would wave to her as he rode by, his scarlet cloak passing behind the dark yew trees and between the open space, whilst she, she, would remain the lonely maid, high up and isolated in the tower, polishing the terrible shield, weaving it a covering with a true device, and waiting, always remote and high. At which point there would be a faint scuffle on the stairs, a light-pitched whispering outside the door, and a creaking of the latch. Then Billy, excited, whispering, "It's locked! It's locked!" Then the knocking, kicking at the door with childish knees, and the urgent, childish, "Ursula! Our Ursula! Ursula! Hey, our Ursula!" No reply. "Ursula! Hey, our Ursula!" The name was shouted now. Still no answer. "Mother, she won't answer," came the yell. "She's dead." "Go away, I'm not dead. What do you want?" came the angry voice of the girl. "Open the door, our Ursula," came the complaining cry. It was all over. She must open the door. She heard the screech of the bucket downstairs, dragged across the flagstones as the woman washed the kitchen floor. And the children were prowling in the bedroom, asking, "What were you doing? What did you lock the door for?" And she discovered the key of the parish room, and betook herself there, and sat on some sacks with her books. There began another dream. She was the only daughter of the old lord. She was gifted with magic. Day followed day of rapt silence, whilst she wandered ghost-like in the hushed, ancient mansion, or flitted along the sleeping terraces. Here a grave grief attacked her, that her hair was dark. She must have fair hair and a white skin. She was rather bitter about her black mane. Never mind, she would dye it when she grew up, or bleach it in the sun till it was bleached fair. Meanwhile she wore a fair white coif of pure Venetian lace. She flitted silently along the terraces, where jewelled lizards basked upon the stone, and did not move when her shadow fell upon them. In the utter stillness she heard the tinkle of the fountain, and smelled the roses whose blossoms hung rich and motionless. So she drifted on the wistful feet of beauty, past the water and the swans, to the noble park, where, underneath a great oak, a doe all dappled lay, with her 4 fine feet together, her fawn nestling sun-coloured beside her. Oh, and this doe was her familiar. It would talk to her, because she was a magician. It would tell her stories as if the sunshine spoke. Then one day she left the door of the parish room unlocked, careless and unheeding as she always was. The children found their way in. Katie cut her finger and howled. Billy hacked notches in the fine chisels, and did much damage. There was a great commotion. The crossness of the mother was soon finished. Ursula locked up in the room again, and considered all was over. Then her father came in with the notched tools, his forehead knotted. "Who the deuce opened the door?" he cried in anger. "It was Ursula who opened the door," said her mother. He had a duster in his hand. He turned and flapped the cloth hard across the girl's face. The cloth stung. For a moment the girl was as if stunned. Then she remained motionless, her face closed and stubborn. But her heart was blazing. In spite of herself the tears surged higher. In spite of her they surged higher. In spite of her, her face broke. She made a curious, gulping grimace, and the tears were falling. So she went away, desolate. But her blazing heart was fierce and unyielding. He watched her go, and a pleasurable pain filled him. A sense of triumph and easy power, followed immediately by acute pity. "I'm sure that was unnecessary, to hit the girl across the face," said the mother coldly. "A flick with the duster won't hurt her," he said. "Nor will it do her any good." For days, for weeks, Ursula's heart burned from this rebuff. She felt so cruelly vulnerable. Did he not know how vulnerable she was, how exposed and wincing? He, of all people, knew, and he wanted to do this to her. He wanted to hurt her right through her closest sensitiveness. He wanted to treat her with shame, to maim her with insult. Her heart burnt in isolation, like a watchfire lighted. She did not forget, she did not forget, she never forgot. When she returned to her love for her father, the seed of mistrust and defiance burned unquenched, though covered up far from sight. She no longer belonged to him unquestioned. Slowly, slowly, the fire of mistrust and defiance burned in her, burned away her connection with him. She ran a good deal alone, having a passion for all moving, active things. She loved the little brooks. Wherever she found a little running water, she was happy. It seemed to make her run and sing in spirit along with it. She could sit for hours by a brook or stream, on the roots of the alders, and watch the water hasten dancing over the stones, or among the twigs of a fallen branch. Sometimes little fish vanished before they had become real, like hallucinations. Sometimes wagtails ran by the water's brink. Sometimes other little birds came to drink. She saw a kingfisher darting blue, and then she was very happy. The kingfisher was the key to the magic world. He was witness of the border of enchantment. But she must move out of the intricate woven illusion of her life, the illusion of a father whose life was an odyssey in an outer world, the illusion of her grandmother, of realities so shadowy and far off that they became as mystic symbols, peasant girls with wreaths of blue flowers in their hair, the sledges and the depths of winter, the dark-bearded young grandfather, marriage and war and death. Then the multitude of illusions concerning herself, how she was truly a princess of Poland, how in England she was under a spell, she was not really this Ursula Brangwen. Then the mirage of her reading. Out of the multicoloured illusion of this, her life, she must move on to the grammar school in Nottingham. She was shy, and she suffered. For one thing, she bit her nails and had a cruel consciousness in her fingertips, a shame, an exposure. Out of all proportion, this shame haunted her. She spent hours of torture, conjuring how she might keep her gloves on, if she might say her hands were scalded, if she might seem to forget to take off her gloves. For she was going to inherit her own estate when she went to the high school. There each girl was a lady. There she was going to walk among free souls, her co-mates and her equals, and all petty things would be put away. Ah, if she would only not bite her nails! If only she had not this blemish! She wanted so much to be perfect, without spot or blemish, living the high, noble life. It was a grief to her that her father made such a poor introduction. He was brief as ever, like a boy saying his errand, and his clothes looked ill-fitting and casual, whereas Ursula would have liked robes and a ceremonial of introduction to this, her new estate. She made a new illusion of school. Miss Gray, the headmistress, had a certain silvery, schoolmistressy beauty of character. The school itself had been a gentleman's house. Dark, sombre lawns separated it from the dark, select avenue. But its rooms were large and of good appearance, and from the back one looked over lawns and shrubbery, over the trees and the grassy slope of the arboretum, to the town which heaped the hollow with its roofs and cupolas and its shadows. So Ursula seated herself upon the hill of learning, looking down on the smoke and confusion and the manufacturing, engrossed activity of the town. She was happy. Up here in the grammar school, she fancied the air was finer, beyond the factory smoke. She wanted to learn Latin and Greek and French and mathematics. She trembled like a postulant when she wrote the Greek alphabet for the first time. She was upon another hill slope, whose summit she had not scaled. There was always the marvellous eagerness in her heart to climb and see beyond. A Latin verb was virgin soil to her. She sniffed a new odour in it. It meant something, though she did not know what it meant. But she gathered it up. It was significant. When she knew that x squared minus y squared equals brackets x plus y brackets x minus y, then she felt that she had grasped something, that she was liberated into an intoxicating air, rare and unconditioned, and she was very glad as she wrote her French exercise, "J'ai donné le pain à mon petit frère." In all these things there was the sound of a bugle to her heart, exhilarating, summoning her to perfect places. She never forgot her brown Longman's first French grammar, nor her Via Latina with its red edges, nor her little grey algebra book. There was always a magic in them. At learning she was quick, intelligent, instinctive, but she was not thorough. If a thing did not come to her instinctively, she could not learn it. And then her mad rage of loathing for all lessons, her bitter contempt of all teachers and schoolmistresses, her recoil to a fierce, animal arrogance made her detestable. She was a free, unabatable animal, she declared in her revolts. There was no law for her, nor any rule. She existed for herself alone. Then ensued a long struggle with everybody, in which she broke down at last, when she had run the full length of her resistance, and sobbed her heart out, desolate. And afterwards, in a chastened, washed out, bodiless state, she received the understanding that would not come before, and went her way sadder and wiser. Ursula and Gudrun went to school together. Gudrun was a shy, quiet, wild creature, a thin slip of a thing hanging back from notice or twisting past to disappear into her own world again. She seemed to avoid all contact instinctively and pursued her own intent way, pursuing half-formed fancies that had no relation to anyone else. She was not clever at all. She thought Ursula clever enough for two. Ursula understood, so why should she, Gudrun, bother herself? The younger girl lived her religious, responsible life in her sister by proxy. For herself, she was indifferent and intent as a wild animal, and as irresponsible. When she found herself at the bottom of the class, she laughed, lazily, and was content, saying she was safe now. She did not mind her father's chagrin, nor her mother's tinge of mortification. "What do I pay for you to go to Nottingham for?" her father asked, exasperated. "Well, Dad, you know you needn't pay for me," she replied, nonchalant. "I'm ready to stop at home." She was happy at home. Ursula was not. Slim and unwilling abroad, Gudrun was easy in her own house as a wild thing in its lair, whereas Ursula, attentive and keen abroad, at home was reluctant, uneasy, unwilling to be herself, or unable. Nevertheless, Sunday remained the maximum day of the week for both. Ursula turned passionately to it, to the sense of eternal security it gave. She suffered anguish of fears during the weekdays, or she felt strong powers that would not recognise her. There was upon her always a fear and a dislike of authority. She felt she could always do as she wanted if she managed to avoid a battle with authority and the authorised powers. But if she gave herself away, she would be lost, destroyed. There was always the menace against her. This strange sense of cruelty and ugliness always imminent, ready to seize hold upon her, this feeling of the grudging power of the mob lying in wait for her, who was the exception, formed one of the deepest influences of her life. Wherever she was, at school, among friends, in the street, in the train, she instinctively abated herself, made herself smaller, feigned to be less than she was, for fear that her undiscovered self should be seen, pounced upon, attacked by brutish resentment of the commonplace, the average self. She was fairly safe at school now. She knew how to take her place there, and how much of herself to reserve. But she was free only on Sundays. When she was but a girl of 14, she began to feel a resentment growing against her in her own home. She knew she was the disturbing influence there, but as yet, on Sundays, she was free, really free, free to be herself, without fear or misgiving. Even at its stormiest, Sunday was a blessed day. Ursula woke to it with a feeling of immense relief. She wondered why her heart was so light. Then she remembered it was Sunday. A gladness seemed to burst out around her, a feeling of great freedom. The whole world was for 24 hours revoked, put back. Only the Sunday world existed. She loved the very confusion of the household. It was lucky if the children slept till 7 o'clock. Usually, soon after 6, a chirp was heard, a voice, an excited chirrup began, announcing the creation of a new day. There was a thudding of quick little feet, and the children were up and about, scampering in their shirts, with pink legs and glistening, flossy hair all clean from the Saturday's night bathing, their souls excited by their bodies' cleanliness. As the house began to teem with rushing, half-naked, clean children, one of the parents rose, either the mother, easy and slatternly, with her thick dark hair loosely coiled and slipping over one ear, or the father, warm and comfortable, with ruffled black hair and shirt unbuttoned at the neck. Then the girls upstairs heard the continual, "Now then, Billy, what are you up to?" in the father's strong, vibrating voice, or the mother's dignified, "I have said, Cassie, I will not have it." It was amazing how the father's voice could ring out like a gong, without his being in the least moved, and how the mother could speak like a queen holding an audience, though her blouse was sticking out all round, and her hair was not fastened up, and the children were yelling a pandemonium. Gradually breakfast was produced, and the elder girls came down into the babel. whilst half-naked children flitted round like the wrong ends of cherubs, as Gudrun said, watching the bare little legs and the chubby tails appearing and disappearing. Gradually the young ones were captured, and nightdresses finally removed, ready for the clean Sunday shirt. But before the Sunday shirt was slipped over the fleecy head, away darted the naked body, to wallow in the sheepskin which formed the parlour rug, whilst the mother walked after, protesting sharply, holding the shirt like a noose, and the father's bronze voice rang out, and the naked child, wallowing on its back in the deep sheepskin, announced gleefully, "I'm bathing in the sea, mother." "Why should I walk after you with your shirt?" said the mother. "Get up now." "I'm bathing in the sea, mother," repeated the wallowing, naked figure. "We say bathing, not bathing," said the mother, with her strange, indifferent dignity. "I am waiting here with your shirt." At length shirts were on, and stockings were paired, and little trousers buttoned and little petticoats tied behind. The besetting cowardice of the family was its shirking of the garter question. "Where are your garters, Cassie?" "I don't know." "Well, look for them." But not one of the elder Brangwens would really face the situation. After Cassie had grovelled under all the furniture and blacked up all her Sunday cleanliness, to the infinite grief of everybody, the garter was forgotten in the new washing of the young face and hands. Later Ursula would be indignant to see Miss Cassie marching into church from Sunday school, with her stockings sluthered down to her ankle, and a grubby knee showing. "It's disgraceful," cried Ursula at dinner. "People would think we're pigs, and the children are never washed." "Never mind what people think," said the mother superbly. "I see that the child is bathed properly, and if I satisfy myself, I satisfy everybody. She can't keep her stocking up and no garter, and it isn't the child's fault she was let to go without one." The garter trouble continued in varying degrees, but till each child wore long skirts or long trousers, it was not removed. On this day of decorum, the Brangwen family went to church by the high road, making a detour outside all the garden hedge rather than climb the wall into the churchyard. There was no law of this from the parents. The children themselves were the wardens of the Sabbath decency, very jealous and instant with each other. It came to be, gradually, that after church on Sundays the house was really something of a sanctuary, with peace breathing like a strange bird alighted in the rooms. Indoors, only reading and tale-telling and quiet pursuits, such as drawing, were allowed. Out of doors, all playing was to be carried on unobtrusively. If there were noise, yelling or shouting, then some fierce spirit woke up in the father and the elder children, so that the younger were subdued, afraid of being excommunicated. The children themselves preserved the Sabbath. If Ursula in her vanity sang, "Il était une bergère, et mon petit patapon," Theresa was sure to cry, "That's not a Sunday song, our Ursula." "You don't know," replied Ursula, superior. Nevertheless, she wavered, and her song faded down before she came to the end. Because, though she did not know it, her Sunday was very precious to her. She found herself in a strange, undefined place, where her spirit could wander in dreams, unassailed. The white-robed spirit of Christ passed between olive trees. It was a vision, not a reality, and she herself partook of the visionary being. There was the voice in the night calling, "Samuel, Samuel," and still the voice called in the night, but not this night, nor last night, but in the unfathomed night of Sunday, of the Sabbath silence. There was sin, the serpent in whom was also wisdom. There was Judas with the money and the kiss. But there was no actual sin. If Ursula slapped Theresa across the face, even on a Sunday, that was not sin, the everlasting. It was misbehaviour. If Billy played truant from Sunday school, he was bad, he was wicked, but he was not a sinner. Sin was absolute and everlasting. Wickedness and badness were temporary and relative. When Billy, catching up the local jargon, called Cassie a sinner, everybody detested him. Yet when there came to the marsh a flippity-floppity foxhound puppy, he was mischievously christened Sinner. The Brangwens shrank from applying their religion to their own immediate actions. They wanted the sense of the eternal and immortal, not a list of rules for everyday conduct. Therefore they were badly behaved children, headstrong and arrogant, though their feelings were generous. They had, moreover, intolerable to their ordinary neighbours, a proud gesture that did not fit with the jealous idea of the democratic Christian, so that they were always extraordinary, outside of the ordinary. How bitterly Ursula resented her first acquaintance with evangelical teachings. She got a peculiar thrill from the application of salvation to her own personal case. Jesus died for me, he suffered for me. There was a pride and a thrill in it, followed almost immediately by a sense of dreariness. Jesus with holes in his hands and feet, it was distasteful to her. The shadowy Jesus with the stigmata, that was her own vision. But Jesus, the actual man, talking with teeth and lips, telling one to put one's finger into his wounds, like a villager gloating in his sores, repelled her. She was enemy of those who insisted on the humanity of Christ. If he were just a man, living in ordinary human life, then she was indifferent. But it was the jealousy of vulgar people which must insist on the humanity of Christ. It was the vulgar mind which would allow nothing extra-human, nothing beyond itself to exist. It was the dirty, desecrating hands of the revivalists which wanted to drag Jesus into this everyday life, to dress Jesus up in trousers and frock coat, to compel him to a vulgar equality of footing. It was the impudent suburban soul which would ask, what would Jesus do if he were in my shoes? Against all this the Brangwens stood at bay. If anyone, it was the mother who was caught by, or who was most careless of the vulgar clamour. She would have nothing extra-human. She never really subscribed, all her life, to Brangwen's mystical passion. But Ursula was with her father. As she became adolescent, 13, 14, she set more and more against her mother's practical indifference. To Ursula, there was something callous, almost wicked in her mother's attitude. What did Anna Brangwen in these years care for God or Jesus or angels? She was the immediate life of today. Children were still being born to her. She was thronged with all the little activities of her family, and almost instinctively she resented her husband's slavish service to the church, his dark, subject hankering to worship an unseen God. What did the unrevealed God matter, when a man had a young family that needed fettling for? Let him attend to the immediate concerns of his life, not go projecting himself towards the ultimate. But Ursula was all for the ultimate. She was always in revolt against babies and muddled domesticity. To her, Jesus was another world. He was not of this world. He did not thrust his hands under her face and, pointing to his wounds, say, "Look, Ursula Brangwen, I got these for your sake. Now do as you're told." To her, Jesus was beautifully remote, shining in the distance, like a white moon at sunset, a crescent moon, beckoning as it follows the sun out of our ken. Sometimes dark clouds standing very far off, pricking up into a clear yellow band of sunset, of a winter evening, reminded her of Calvary. Sometimes the full moon rising blood red upon the hill terrified her with the knowledge that Christ was now dead, hanging heavy and dead upon the cross. On Sundays this visionary world came to pass. She heard the long hush. She knew the marriage of dark and light was taking place. In church the voice sounded, re-echoing, not from this world, as if the church itself were a shell that still spoke the language of creation. "The sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them. The same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown." Over this Ursula was stirred as by a call from far off. In those days, would not the sons of God have found her fair? Would she not have been taken to wife by one of the sons of God? It was a dream that frightened her, but she could not understand it. Who were the sons of God? Was not Jesus the only begotten Son? Was not Adam the only man created from God? Yet there were men not begotten by Adam. Who were these, and whence did they come? They too must derive from God. Had God many offspring, besides Adam and besides Jesus? Children whose origin the children of Adam cannot recognise. And perhaps these children, these sons of God, had known no expulsion, no ignominy of the fall. These came on free feet to the daughters of men, and saw they were fair, and took them to wife, so that the women conceived and brought forth men of renown. This was a genuine fate. She moved about in the essential days, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. Nor would any comparison of myths destroy her passion in the knowledge.